afternoon and welcome. My name is Monica Murray, and I am the Public Programming Officer at the New York City Department of Records and Information Services, also known as DORIS. DORIS houses the city's municipal archives and library and is focused on fostering civic life by preserving and providing access to the historical and contemporary records of the New York City government and its peoples. Thank you for joining us for this month's Learn to Learn Our Lady of the World's Fair with author Ruth D. Nelson. I'll quickly begin by introducing the speaker and then pass it over to her to begin today's presentation. Ruth D. Nelson is an instructor in arts history at the College of DuPage and the author of Searching for Marquette. In 2018, Nelson was selected as a State of Illinois Humanities Council Rhodes Scholar, and she is a recipient of the Rakow Grant of Glass Research from the Corning Museum of Glass. And now I'll turn it over to Ruth to begin her presentation.
So thank you, Monica. It's just a pleasure and an honor to be presenting here today. And let me switch over to share my screen. And before we get started, I would like to give a shout out to Kate Figgery at the Archdiocese of New York Archives, Tal Naden at the New York Public Library, and to Joseph Cohen at the Diocese of Brooklyn Archives. Those three archivists were so helpful to me. Okay, thank you. As many of you know, between April and October 1964, and then again in 1965, a grand total of 52 million people from around the world gathered in Queens for the New York World's Fair. The event remains a touchstone for many American baby boomers who visited the fair as children before the full impact of the countercultural social changes, turbulence of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War were felt. The man behind the fair was Robert Moses, who more than any figure in the 20th century shaped the cityscape of New York. A man with unimaginable energy, he at one time held simultaneously 12 positions, all appointed. And I'm sure I'm telling you a lot that you already know. But from these posts, Moses expanded the state and city park systems, built highways, bridges, playgrounds, housing, tunnels, beaches, zoos, civic centers, and along the way, 2 World's Fairs. Though he was vilified by the end of his lifetime, Moses' contributions are now being reconsidered in a more positive light. He was famous not just for his ambition and seemingly unlimited energy, but also for his less than diplomatic manner in which he treated those who crossed or merely disagreed with him. There was at least one person, however, to whom Moses extended every courtesy, and that was Cardinal Francis Spellman. Moses was Bob to Spellman, but Spellman was always Your Eminence to Moses. Moses was born to a secular German Jewish family, graduated from Yale, and standing over 6 feet tall, presented an imposing figure. Spellman was of Massachusetts Irish ancestry, was stocky, studied in Rome to become a priest, and emerged a prince of the church. Spellman was installed the 6th Archbishop of New York in 1939, the same year Moses opened the first New York World's Fair. Like Moses, Spellman wielded enormous political and cultural influence in New York City. And he was as savvy about the business of the church as he was about its mission. Spellman quickly learned that the archdiocese was in financial trouble when he started as archbishop. with mortgages totaling at that time close to 28 million. After a thorough analysis, he undertook a sweeping reorganization of the archdiocese by centralizing, then refinancing the debt at much more favorable terms. Initially, the banks weren't happy about this, but when Spellman suggested moving his banking to Boston, they quietly fell in line. Pastors, too, were reluctant to surrender their fiscal control, but the savings they saw outweighed any resistance. So, in essence, the archdiocese became the central bank for all church enterprises. In 1947, Spellman made his expectations clear when he introduced his 25 million diocesan building plan to the presidents of the largest construction firms and the heads of the building and trade unions. So I'm just giving a little background to set the stage before we actually get to the fair. He asked for two things from the construction companies: a good job for the price, and from labor, a good day's work for the pay. He got both, and the archdiocesan building boom was on. And to understand the magnitude of this new construction program, second only to the cities, consider this 5-year period from 1955 to 1959. New construction was begun on 15 churches, 94 schools, 22 rectories, 60 convents, and hundreds of additions, alterations, and repairs totaling 168 million. And in today's dollars, that would be 1.6 billion. Since his tenure had begun in 1939, Spellman was also responsible for building Catholic hospitals as well as expanding the high school system. Spellman asserted his control from the office of the Chancery, which was 1 block away from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and from this command post, nicknamed the Powerhouse, Spellman administered what was the wealthiest Catholic diocese in the world. Unlike Moses, however, Spellman's influence extended well beyond New York. It was global. In addition to his role as military vicar and a sometimes confidant of President Franklin Roosevelt, he was responsible for the church's largest foreign aid program, Catholic Relief Services, with a 1964 budget of 176 million, and that is close to 2 billion today. For his administrative and financial skill, he acquired the nickname Cardinal Moneybags by some in Rome, but the world was better for it. Now, for either man to accomplish his goals, working collaboratively was a necessity. In Robert Caro's Power Broker, the definitive biography of Robert Moses, he states that sometimes Moses and the church swapped pieces of land as casually as if they were playing Monopoly. So it wasn't quite that simple. For example, for Moses to build Lincoln Center, it meant the loss of St. Michael's Parish at 216 West 68th Street. And losing a parish was never easy for Spellman. But then Moses owed him. Nevertheless, a natural alliance formed between the two as contractors and trades, just like the American church, were dominated by the Irish Catholics. How did the Irish ascend to such prominence? Well, they had advantages that other Catholic immigrants didn't have. One, they spoke English. They were accustomed to financially supporting the church, and they had already experienced anti-Catholic prejudice and knew how to use their political power to fight it. All these reasons, wrote Loyola professor Lawrence McCaffrey, the Irish were the only European ethnics who could have led the American Catholic community into an accommodation with the dominant Anglo-American Protestant ethos. Politically, Spellman had always stood firm against communist aggression. While the Vatican, led after 1958 by Pope John the 23rd, had begun to move away from the hard anti-communism of Pope Pius XII. So John was regarded as a reconciler. With this new openness, the Vatican agreed to participate and build a pavilion for the first time for the 1958 Brussels Universal and International Exhibition. The Vatican had participated in other world fairs, but this was the first time it built its own pavilion. Expo 58, as it was called, was the first World's Fair since 1939, and it was an opportunity for Europe to showcase its technological, industrial, and cultural progress after the devastation of World War II. Coming at the height of the Cold War, the Brussels Fair proved to be one of the most important propaganda events to be staged by European allies in the Eisenhower years. And this is one of the features of a fair you really get to put your own story forth. While some pavilions promoted culture as their weapon in the battle against communism, the Vatican put forward the life of Christ and the message of the church. The goal was to counter the influence of secularism, namely the Soviet Union and its satellites. And they did this by presenting the Catholic way of life. It was very well received. And the pavilion here was paid for by the European Catholic countries. This is an important point. It was shared across these countries. Now, back to America, with the involvement in the Vietnam War gaining momentum, there was a growing dissonance between the pre and post-war two generations regarding not only the war, but also long-held traditions and values. The social capital that Moses and Spellman had banked on for so long began to shift. The world in which both men operated was changing, and it was changing fast. But before the big shifts that would soon erupt across the country, there was to be one spectacular collaboration between these two powerful men. Moses grabbed onto the idea of a second New York World's Fair as a means to realize his goal of completing Flushing Meadows Park. Moses knew that approval by an international organization, the Bureau of International Expositions, would assure that its nearly 40 member nations would participate in the fair and guarantee its success. The BIE was in charge of overseeing and regulating World Expos, and it had its rules. So I'll refer to it as the BIE. The BIE rules stated that a fair could run for one 6-month period only. But Moses knew from his experience with the 1939 New York World's Fair, which did not turn a profit, although World's Fairs rarely turn a profit, but he knew that he needed to attract 70 million people to make a profit, and that meant it had to run for 2 years, 2 6-month periods. The BIE said no rent could be charged to exhibitors. Well, again, Moses knew that would not work. Exhibitors who would build their own pavilions would have to pay rent. He made exceptions, though, one for religious groups and the second for the state pavilions, US state pavilions. And then the BIE said only one exposition in any given country within a 10-year period. And the Seattle World's Fair had already been sanctioned for 1962, and that was 2 years prior. But Moses knew that exceptions could be made because look at here, Chicago's 1933 fair, Century of Progress, and the 1939 World's Fair here in New York were within a 10-year period. So he wasn't going to bend to their rules. But to make matters worse, the BIE was located in Paris. When he returned to New York, he badmouthed the BIE to the New York Times. So the BIE retaliated by formally requesting that its member nations, like the major countries in Europe, not participate in the New York World's Fair. Additionally, New York was forced to compete with both Seattle and Montreal, which was coming in 1967, for the participants, with many nations choosing the officially sanctioned World's Fair over New York, the New York Fair. But still, there were plenty who really wanted to be in New York regardless. But anyway, so now Moses had a problem. So he turned to trade and tourism organizations such as the Chambers of Commerce within many of these countries to sponsor national exhibits in lieu of official government sponsorship of pavilions. It opened up opportunities for smaller countries to exhibit, and it was especially important to invite African nations to participate as a way to keep them on our side of the Cold War. Moses said that, I would add, the African countries, many of them newly independent, didn't have the funds to set up their own pavilions, but they collaborated in one larger African pavilion. Moses said that he would not consider the fair a success unless the three most powerful organizations in the world participated. One, the US government. Check. General Motors. Check. And then the Vatican. So Moses leaned on Cardinal Spellman to bring the Vatican to the fair. And initially, Spellman was not enthusiastic. Unlike the pavilion at Brussels, where costs were shared, Spellman knew that he would have to shoulder this responsibility himself, and he had plenty of other uses for this money. However, once the idea of bringing over the Pietà was floated, he had a change of heart. And maybe it was just the sheer audacity of it. According to one account, he would agree to build the pavilion for Pope John if he would send over the Pietà. When the news of this loan hit the press, it felt to the Italians in the art world like an atom bomb had just been dropped on them. Italians were outraged, and let's consider how they felt. I mean, for example, what if China asked us to send over the Statue of Liberty? It was like that. But the deal was made. And since we're here, let's briefly discuss the Pietà, just to give some background. Michelangelo was 24 when he completed this masterpiece in 1499. He was commissioned by the French Cardinal in Rome for his funeral chapel in Old St. Peter's, but he died before it was finished. Michelangelo never signed his works, but was visiting the chapel where he overheard pilgrims crediting this sculpture to another sculptor. Well, he was so outraged. He came back that night and chiseled his name in on the sash across Mary's chest, an action that he later regretted. But the work catapulted Michelangelo's career, and ever since, this work has been considered one of the greatest masterpieces of Western civilization. Spellman recruited Edward Kinney, Director of Purchasing and Shipping for Catholic Relief Services, to head up the Vatican transport team. Now, there happened to be a plaster cast of the sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum storage facility, and Kinney and his team used it for measurements and to identify vulnerabilities. They traveled to the Vatican to prepare for the shipment of the Pietà, but they needed to know if there were any internal fissures or cracks that could imperil the project. They enlisted Kodak to x-ray the statue. It was indeed carved from one perfect block of marble with no cracks or fissures. The team, though, the American team, met with resistance from those in the Vatican in charge of moving its treasures, and they were the Montenovi family. They had been packaging and shipping Vatican Museum items for generations, but their methods hadn't changed much from the time of Napoleon. They wrapped the sculpture in linen, then filled the crate with excelsior, which is a fancy name for wood shavings. Well, that would never do. The American team rejected this out of hand, but they had been doing their research and they had a better material. The newly formed or invented styrofoam, and that's what they used to fill and cushion the crate. So there's an inner crate, there was also an outer crate. Together, the container and the marble sculpture weighed approximately 5 tons. But because of a total of 400 pounds of styrofoam were used, the container was so buoyant that it could float. So here we see, this is not the best photo, I apologize for that, but the Pietà, the crate, then was secured on the deck of the ship. And after my book came out, I started hearing from people that they had these wonderful stories. And so, just as a side note, a priest from Sacred Heart, the Sacred Heart Parish in Monroe, New York, Father David Ryder, was told by one of his parishioners that he and his wife, they were Italian immigrants, they were coming over to America on the same ship as the Pietà, and the name of the ship was the Christopher Columbus. And among the other Italians there, they were told without any irony, that if the ship started to sink, to literally hold on to Mary. So now let's take a look at the Vatican Pavilion. It was one of 140. It was not the largest nor the most dazzling, but it spoke most clearly to the human spirit. So now it hosted the blockbuster that Moses needed to ensure the fair was a success. And it was a huge public success, but not a financial success. But Moses did get the part he wanted. This was collaboratively designed by the architectural firms of York and Sawyer, Hurley and Hughes, and Luders and Associates. It was an interesting time because the Second Vatican Council was taking place at the same time as the fair. So the pavilion had to keep up with a number of changes that were being issued. And one of them was to embrace modern art. And that's what they did. And we are looking at the Beatitudes wall, and the top banner was done by Sister Corita Kent. And this is what it looked like. It looks like in color. She was one of those artistic contributors, and World's Fairs are often launching pads for young artists. And she became very popular, but she was too Catholic for the art world, and she was too radical for the church at that time. So decades later now, of all the artists who exhibited at this pavilion, she has received a second wave of enthusiasm. So a younger generation has embraced her and her art. As far the last that I knew, this banner is in Cleveland at the headquarters for the United Church of Christ. They purchased it at the close of the fair. Now, to design the set for the Pietà, Spellman tapped Joe Mielziner, who was described as the most successful set designer of the golden era of Broadway. Mielziner had Jewish roots, but through the influence of his friend, the then Father Fulton J. Sheen, he converted to Catholicism. So he offered his services for free. Many expected him to recreate the Baroque setting of the Vatican chapel, but no. He insisted on a contemporary setting, which was very appropriate for the pavilion. He had two objectives with his design. First, he wanted the angle of observation by the viewers to be as close as possible to Michelangelo's original intention. Over the centuries at the Vatican, they had tampered with the angle, so it was not the way Michelangelo had intended it to be viewed. And then the second goal he had was to make sure he met Cardinal Spellman's approval, which he did. And lighting was his specialty. So here is one of the beautiful shots of the Pietà close up with very dramatic lighting. The viewing area was designed with 3 moving walkways. See, this was a longer stage, and from one end to the other, there were 3 moving conveyor belts. They wanted to make sure they kept people moving. They didn't want to rush them through. So each conveyor belt had a different speed. The first one closest to the statue had the fastest, and then every following conveyor belt was incrementally slower. The 4th walkway had no conveyor belt, so if you wanted to, you could stand there and just meditate on the sculpture as long as you wanted. Again, the public loved this, but the art critics, not so much. And we're talking about John Kennedy, the art critic for the New York Times. So when I was doing my research, I was reading these clips from the New York Times, and I thought, did we go to the same fair? I mean, they were so harsh, not all of the articles, but in a way, the editorial staff now was a younger group. So it was a different attitude. Maybe they might not want to criticize Moses or Spellman directly, but by taking aim at the fair or even at the pavilion, these two, the fair and the pavilion, served as proxies for Moses and Spellman. You might also wonder why, if this fair is 2 years, or what would they do with the Pietà when the fair closed in 64 at the end of October and before it opened again in 65 in April? Well, they had encased the Pietà in a custom-built cage. They covered the cage with an asbestos blanket in case there was a fire, and they installed a sprinkler system, and it was guarded 24/7 with a highly sophisticated security system and security guard. But this system was so sensitive that the only time it was triggered was by light snowfall one winter night. The pavilion was filled with art through the centuries. So complementing the Pietà were transparencies, of course in color, of the Sistine Chapel on loan from Life magazine. And they were mounted in these very large light boxes, which were very popular at the time. The pavilion also featured replicas of early Christian art. At the crown, the top of the pavilion, was the chapel. And the chapel was modeled after the umbraculum, which is a type of umbrella and a symbol of the papacy. Now, this was something I also learned after I finished the book. So initially, it looked like a tent, and that's what I wrote. But I reconsidered that it's really more of the umbraculum. Now, the wonderful thing about this chapel is that it was saved. It was saved by a priest who was looking then for an architect to build the church, the new Catholic church in Groton, Connecticut. So if you go to St. Mary's Church in Groton, Connecticut, you can almost relive a part of this pavilion. I haven't been myself, but I look forward to it. Everything was saved. So also, moving along, one artist, Norman Laliberte from Montreal, he did a lot of design work, and he also did these liturgical banners, which set the trend for liturgical art for decades. They were very popular. You also see along the bottom, there is a gift shop. Now, if you were visiting the fair and you wanted to buy a souvenir with the image of the Pietà, you could only buy it at the Vatican Pavilion. Other pavilions were trying to sort of piggyback off the popularity, but it was very tightly controlled. So even though the fair didn't make money, the gift shop did. In fact, they earned enough money to finance the very first visit by a pope ever to the Western Hemisphere. And by this time now, Pope John the 23rd had passed away, and now Paul VI was the Pope. So he was only scheduled to visit one day. It was only for one day. He flew in from Italy. He started out with a welcome at St. Patrick's Cathedral, attended by politicians, celebrity, and the Kennedys. But let's look at the slide for a second. We have Cardinal Spellman on his right, the right of the Pope. And there's sort of a tender scene, which he's holding on to the Pope. And then behind the Pope on the left is a satellite player, the powerful Monsignor from Cicero, Illinois, Paul Marcinkus, named the gorilla for his imposing figure. And he sometimes had to use his strength as the papal bodyguard, but the term bodyguard, however, was inadequate to describe the roles that he held and the influence that he had. Now, he thought he could manage Moses, but we'll get to that in a second. After this ceremony, welcome ceremony, the Pope met with LBJ, President Johnson, who flew into New York to have a small conference, small meeting with the Pope. Then the Pope went on to speak at United Nations, which was the main purpose of his visit. He had received an invitation to speak at United Nations. Then there was an ecumenical service with Jewish leaders, and then a huge mass at Yankee Stadium, 50,000 in attendance. And before he was to fly home, he was to visit the Vatican Pavilion. It was not to be a visit to the fair. Marcinkus had laid this out, that the papal motorcade was to come through a side entrance, a side gate closest to the pavilion. But Moses had waited so long to get a papal visit. After numerous invitations, it was always no, no, no. Finally, the Pope is in New York, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity wasted. His visit was supposed to be under the radar, but Moses made sure that the motorcade came through the main entrance, greeted by a marching band, thousands of visitors, the press, and fireworks. So it became quite an event that Moses was not going to let slip through his hand. And also, to just get a sense, anytime the Pope comes to an American city, it's a big deal. But since this was the very first time, we see here, and this is a great photo from the archives of the Diocese of Brooklyn, that crowds lined up the side of the road, and even the train stopped, so passengers could view the motorcade. I almost get a little choked up about that. So June 1967, Moses officially handed over the fairgrounds to the city of New York. Moses wanted to mark where the Vatican Pavilion stood and to also commemorate the Pope's visit. He oversaw the construction of this bench called an exedra, and that was funded through private donations. So when I was writing this book, my coworker, a young gal in her 20s, with an art degree, asked me, well, what is the topic of your book? And I said, well, you know Michelangelo's Pietà? And she said, no. So it got me to thinking that because of this fair, a whole generation of American baby boomers could say that they did know the Pietà, and that maybe they even visited the fair. And this is my family. My father's taking the photo, and I'm the first one on the left. But of course, we all grew up knowing about the Pietà. And we didn't grow up in a Catholic family, but we always had that respect. So this concludes my presentation. If you're interested in learning more, and there is so much more to this story, the book is available on Amazon or through Cornell University Press, or maybe you could just request that your local library pick up a copy. So thank you everyone for attending and joining me today. And I think we can turn it back over to our sponsors here.
Okay, so our first question, who came up with the idea of exhibiting the Pietà? Was it Spellman himself?
That is a very good question. There is the more I read and researched, there were a couple names that came up, but the most official one in the archives of the New York Public Library was Redmond, the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the time. He made a list for Moses of potential masterpieces, but it was really only the Pietà that grabbed everyone's interest. That was a good question. Thank you.
Okay, this is a little bit longer, but Chris asks, well, one, thank you for this talk. Finds the topic fascinating. In any of your research or work on this subject, did you come across the name Veronica Lewickin, aka the Seer of Bayside, Queens? She was a traditionalist Catholic leader who opposed Vatican II and came to see the Vatican Pavilion as a holy site. Her followers in New York City still visit this site regularly to worship.
Yes, I did, because she also is a kind of part of the legacy, because it is at the Exedra that it's become a pilgrimage site, not just for her followers, but for many people, but especially uh, for her followers who are Virginia Lukens had received messages from Mary. This has not been, I don't want to get too deep into this because I don't know the details, but she does have a very popular following there at the fairgrounds. They come to the Exedra. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Marianne asks, can we still see the Exedra in the park?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And how was the Pietà returned to Rome?
Okay, another good question. It was returned the exact opposite of how it was sent. So every step that the shippers took to pack the sculpture, that they did the reverse, exactly the reverse, sending it back. The same crate, the same styrofoam, the same location on the ship going back. So yes, they had that good experience to draw from.
Okay. Do we know the Pope's reaction to seeing how the Pietà was displayed at the pavilion? Did he like the display?
Now, another great point. Yes, actually, uh, he was very pleased with it. And there were Vatican officials who said, well, actually, people can see it better here than in the Vatican. So they approved. They were pleased.
There are 9 sandcast reliefs from the pavilion that are currently at Ascension Church in Hamden. Do you talk about them in your book? They mentioned they are endangered because the church has closed.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Sure. There are 9 sandcast reliefs from the pavilion that are currently at Ascension
Oh,
Church in Hamden. And they're apparently endangered because the church has closed. And the question is, do you speak of them in your book?
no, I don't think I did. That's very interesting. This is why I get all this new information. Uh, I may have a record of it. Uh, I don't remember offhand, but usually something like artwork in churches, it's always sad to hear that. But usually there are buyers for these pieces. I didn't realize that there were items from the pavilion at this church. So I hope, in fact, they are saved and a buyer comes forth. Thank you for that.
Okay, Joe asks, did the Vatican exhibit make a profit? How many visitors did it have?
It had 27 million visitors. And yeah, that is a very good point. I should have mentioned that. It wasn't the most popular pavilion. That was General Motors Futurama, but it was the second most popular. I think GM had 29 million, but the Vatican Pavilion had 27 million.
Okay. Was the Pietà insured, and for how much?
It was insured, and it was insured for $50 million. But really, people kind of scoffed at that because how could you insure a masterpiece? If something were to happen, that would be it. But yes, it was fully insured.
Okay. Then we have a couple of comments. Eric K. Washington, a friend of Doris, an author, said, "Thank you, no question, but he does
Oh,
still remember seeing the Pietà at the World's Fair when he was 9 or 10 years old."
oh, nice. Thank you.
Richard mentions that codex documentation of the Pietà was crucial when it was attacked and damaged about 10 years later
Oh,
in Italy.
that is so interesting. I didn't know. See, I'm just learning more and more. I never got documentation from Kodak before my book was finished, but I do have a request in for more. That is, and there is some irony. Yes, I mentioned that in the book that everyone was so fearful, and rightly so, that the sculpture was going to be sent across the Atlantic Ocean. But I mean, it came back. It was returned in perfect condition. And then I think it was 1974, someone came at it with a hammer and did some very serious damage. So it was had to be repaired, reconstructed in parts.
Okay, we do have one more question. Oh, a couple more. For sure, this was an American Catholic moment. Can you say more about the visitors to the pavilion? To the pavilion, they said, "I don't mean the millions. I think like Notre Dame football team made a visit, and the symbolism of such groups."
Yes, there were. I when I was in the archives, I could look over week by week the visitors, different groups that had come. It was huge because not only groups from around the country, although it was much easier for those on the East Coast, but you had celebrities, you had Princess Grace, you had the Jacqueline Kennedy at that time with her children, all the Kennedys came. You had all politicians pass through, and also heads of foreign countries, of foreign states. So it was very well attended. And there's something else I wanted to say about that. Oh yeah. Oh, it was just as equally popular with non-Catholics. Uh, like my own family, it was just wonderfully received, and it was just considered a chance to see a masterpiece. Not many people could fly to Italy at that time. So, really, regardless of what your background was, it was very well received.
Okay. Did the Disney company have anything to do with the Vatican exhibit, given its influence on the World's Fair?
Very good question. Disney was all over the fair, but no, it did not have any involvement with the Vatican Pavilion.
Okay. Howard mentions that he also remembers going out to the highway in Queens to watch the Pope drive by in his motorcade.
Oh, very sweet.
Okay. Has the Pietà left Italy since the New York World's Fair?
No, and that is also a good point because while the Pietà was in New York, uh, the Italian government passed a law forbidding national treasures such as a Pietà to ever leave the homeland again. So it won't be leaving ever, ever again.
Any sense on the number of people who have seen the Pietà in total beyond the World's Fair?
Oh, no. No, but boy, countless ever since 1499. So that would be 1500, about 700 years. Just billions of people have passed through St. Peter's and made sure to see it.
Okay. And then I think the last question is, what is the lasting meaning of this story in your opinion?
Well, it's a story about uh, several things like the cooperation between Moses and Spellman, and also the impact it had on a whole generation of baby boomers who saw it, and they learned about that piece of art history. But it could be fading. It could be fading as younger generations, our society becomes more secular, less emphasis is, less attention may be drawn to the Pietà, and maybe more focus on other of Michelangelo's uh, masterpieces. But I would say the Vatican participated in this fair. This fair, the implications of the New York World's Fair is just reverberating throughout the decades. And it is now, we're going back just as I did with the Vatican Pavilion. Other academics are looking at other pavilions and other, just studying about how their presentations set trends for society. So, yeah, very interesting question. We need another New York World's Fair.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to Monica, but I just want to remind everyone that we do have an exhibit at 31 Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan near City Hall that will be up at least through the end of the year. So please come and see it Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And I'll turn it over to Monica.
Thank you, Latanya.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's Lunch and Learn. And a special thank you to Ruth for presenting at this month's Lunch and Learn. This was actually really interesting. A lot of, especially staff here at Doris has been telling me all about the New York World's Fair as we prepared for our exhibit. To kind of get more information on it was amazing. And then for our attendees, be sure to sign up for our mailing list so you are the first to know about our upcoming events and exhibitions. And thank you again, and we hope to see you all soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Monica. Bye-bye.